This video is going to cover information on the ways in which the United States measures crime. And one of the reasons that we need to know about measuring crime and how we measure crime is to know whether or not it's increasing or decreasing. Understanding the ways in which we measure crime also helps us come up with explanations for the causes of crime. But unfortunately, it's difficult to accurately measure crime. One of my favorite books, pictured on the right here, is called The Mismeasure of Crime. And if you're interested in this, that would be a great book to read. So we are going to talk about a few different types of data that are used to measure crime. So this first one is the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports. So I will say UCR to refer to Uniform Crime Reports. We're going to contrast this with the National Incidence-Based Reporting System, which is known as NIBRS, N-I-B-R-S, and then we're going to contrast that with the National Crime Victimization Survey, known as the NCVS, and then I'll talk a little bit about self-report studies. So to begin with the Uniform Crime Reports, this is designed by the FBI, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, had implemented this in 1929, 1930s. And the reason that it was implemented was because the United States wanted a reliable way to measure crime. And this enabled us to determine what the crime rate was. So the crime rate is essentially the number of reported crimes divided by the population of the jurisdiction, and it's generally multiplied by 100,000 persons. So that will tell us the rate. That kind of goes back to the ways in which the FBI's crime clock is calculated. So in the UCR, the different police precincts report crimes to the FBI, and the FBI, or the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they collect all of that information and then compiles it into this UCR data set. So this is an official statistic on crime because it reflects formal responses to crime. So it's tapping police behavior more than anything, because it is police who are reporting on their arrests. So it's all about crimes that are known to police. So anything that police don't know about are not included in the UCR. The UCR is considered summary reporting because there is not information recorded on every single offense. So instead, it's a summary of the number of offenses known to police and the number of unfounded things reported to police, so that could be false complaints. And so then it includes the number of actual offenses. So that's the difference between the offenses that are known and reported and the offenses that are unfounded. Additionally, this summary includes the total number of offenses cleared, and for an arrest to be cleared, that means that it was solved and someone was arrested. And additionally, this data set includes the number of clearances involving a juvenile, so usually a person under the age of 18. So it's a summary because it's generally just reporting numbers. For most offenses, although some of them, for most of them, it does not include detailed information. It's just the number that occurred. What is interesting about this data set is that it's voluntary for police precincts to participate. Even though it's voluntary, however, about 98% of the population is covered by this. So, police precincts are not required to report any information on crime from their area to the FBI, but many precincts do. So the crimes that are included in the UCR are broken down into different types. So it includes Part 1 and Part 2 crimes or offenses. There are 10 crimes that fall under Part 1 crimes, and there are 21 or more crimes that fall under Part 2 offenses. As I said, it's voluntary for police precincts to report their information for the UCR, but if they do, it is mandatory that they report on Part 1 crimes. However, it's optional for them to report on Part 2 crimes. And the information included for Part 1 crimes tends to be a little bit more detailed, but again, most of the information that's recorded are just the numbers as opposed to details surrounding each crime. So the 10 offenses or crimes that fall under Part 1 crimes include violent crimes and property crimes. So the violent crimes that are included are homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And so those are some things that you may know the definition of from earlier material. And then human trafficking, the UCR differentiates between two types of human trafficking. The property crimes that are included are burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. So again, you may know some of those definitions and how to define those types of crimes from earlier material, either in this course or previous courses that you have taken. Now, do not feel the need to write all of these down. These are just giving you, it's more important for you to understand the context of that. The UCR for Part 1 crimes, police precincts are mandated to only report on Part 1. So that's only 10 crimes. So for these Part 2 offenses, you don't necessarily have to memorize all of these. These are just listed to show you that these are crimes that when precincts are partaking in the UCR, they do not have to report any information on these. So that means that the data that's collected for the UCR has fairly incomplete data on these types of offenses. And so it's considered lacking and limited because you can't necessarily compile accurate information for all of these crimes. And if you notice that there are a handful of white-collar crimes, forgery and fraud, embezzlement, those types of things. So this is suggesting that it's maybe not as important for the government to collect information on white-collar crimes, because if it was very important, they would have categorized those as Part 1 and mandated police precincts to report on those crimes. So just something to think about. So some issues against the UCR, so some criticisms or limitations, is that the Part 1 crimes, there's only 10. And so the data that is available is limited to a smaller number of crimes. And additionally, keeping in mind that that data that is available is fairly limited because this is a summary reporting system. So there's just numbers reported on these crimes, not necessarily the details. I will say there are some of the Part 1 crimes, so say for example homicide, that they have additional information that is collected on, and so that can be a little bit more information, but for most of the crimes it's just numbers. So you can't get a lot of information, just the numbers. So another issue with the UCR is that it can underestimate crime. So if you recall that police have discretion in reporting crimes, so if a crime is less serious, that they don't always have to arrest someone or charge someone especially if they're engaging in multiple offenses, that they may only choose to charge an individual with one of many offenses. So in this case, that because police have discretion, And say, for example, another way in which police might exercise discretion is that even if they think a crime has occurred, they may not even report it because it would be a lower crime or the amount of paperwork that's required to report crimes. So, police have discretion to record crimes, so they may not record them. Additionally, this can underestimate crime because not everyone reports crimes. So there are plenty of individuals who are victims of crimes that do not report them to the police. And so anything that's not known to police is not included in the UCR. So all of the crimes that are not reported to police are considered to be the quote-unquote dark figure of crime. And those crimes are not known to police, and so those are not included in the UCR. And it's interesting because with some of the future pieces of data that we'll talk about, it's estimated that police really only know about 3% of all crimes that occur. So even if police reported on every single crime that they were aware of, that still, it's only approximately 3% of crimes that are even going to be included in the UCR. So, a very big underestimation of crime. And then another reason that the UCR underestimates crime is because of the hierarchy rule and the hotel rule. The hierarchy rule essentially means that police precincts only report the most serious offense if there are several offenses that occur in one criminal act. So say, for example, if an individual engages in homicide, burglary, rape, and say that those are 3 crimes that an individual engages in, that with the hierarchy rule, only the most serious offense, which homicide is ranked as the most serious, that is the only one that is recorded. There are some instances in which the hierarchy rule is not applicable, so there's certain crimes that they will record no matter what. But just by and large, understand that the hierarchy rule means that if several offenses are committed in approximately the same time and same place, that only the most serious is recorded. The hotel rule is interesting because this suggests that if there is a place in which multiple crimes have occurred, that the police precinct will only count it as being one crime. So in the context of a hotel, if someone goes into multiple hotel rooms and steals something from multiple hotel rooms, because it's under one ownership of a hotel, it's only recorded as one crime. So this could also apply to storage units or apartment complexes. So if there's one owner of a location and multiple crimes are occurred, that it's only counted as one crime. So that can underestimate crime as well. And then additionally, there can be misleading data on the characteristics of arrestees. And remember, because the UCR reflects police behavior. So police have discretion on who to arrest and what and when to report crimes. So, in many instances, scholars have recognized that the criminal justice system is biased against racial and ethnic minorities, and so police may be more likely to arrest a minority suspect. And so then that presents itself as being that minorities are overrepresented in crime. However, there's a lot of research that suggests that self-report studies show that racial and ethnic minorities engage in similar levels of crime, especially for drug crimes, as do non-minority folks. And so since the UCR reflects arrest data, that it could mischaracterize typical offenders, especially if you take into account that the UCR doesn't consistently report white-collar crimes. And notably, white-collar crimes are more often committed by individuals who are white and wealthy. And so if those aren't consistently being counted in the UCR, that may present misleading data on arrestee characteristics. So some other things that aren't included on the slide are that there could be some issues between different police precincts. So by states, we have sometimes different definitions of crimes across states, and this can be difficult because then the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the FBI, when compiling that information, it may be difficult to interpret the definitions of different crimes across different states. So the definitions of crimes can be an issue in the UCR. I think that was, so one other thing too is that the UCR does not always differentiate between attempted crimes and completed crimes. So there's a couple of crimes that they will record that to or report that, but not for every crime. So they don't always acknowledge the difference between attempted and completed. So I think that covers most of the criticisms that I wanted to mention to you about the UCR. So we're going to contrast the UCR now with the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is also known as NIBRS. So I will say NIBRS, N-I-B-R-S, to indicate this particular data set. So again, NIBRS is also reported by police, and this was started a little bit later. So the UCR had started in the 1930s, and this was started in the late 1980s. And one of the reasons that NIBRS was launched or started was because they wanted to collect more information for each crime. So NIBRS, also collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or the FBI, is an incident reporting system. So instead of being a summary reporting system, it's incident-based. So that means per each incident, there is more information presented. Although the UCR is currently the primary source of crime data in the United States, NIBRS is planned to be the primary source by 2021. So as of the last time I checked, NIBRS is problematic because it only covers about 25% of the population, and that's perhaps because this is so tedious to complete that not nearly as many precincts participate. So again, this is voluntary for police precincts to report their information to, and they may not report it because this entails the reporting of many more details than the UCR. So we'll get to why this is so much more detailed than the UCR now. So some perhaps benefits for NIBRS compared to UCR is that there's no hierarchy rule, that each offense in a crime is recorded, not just the worst crime. In NIBRS, they also acknowledge the difference between attempted and completed crimes. So as I had mentioned, the UCR doesn't differentiate between attempted and completed. The only crimes that the UCR differentiates between attempted and completed crimes are rape and burglary, not for any other crimes. Versus NIBRS recognizes the difference between attempted and completed crimes for all of their Group A offenses. And so I'll mention the Group A offenses momentarily. One other thing that's nice with the NIBRS dataset is that it documents the relationship between the victim and the offender. So it could be that, was the victim a husband, was it the wife, was it the employer? So they want to know, how were the victim and offender related? In NIBRS, the data set includes information on the relationship between the victim and offender for any crime against a person. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit here too. But that includes many offenses. And that's different from the UCR because the UCR only includes the relationship between the victim and the offender for homicides. So, NIBRS has a lot more information on that particular relationship between the victim and offender. For the circumstances of a crime, the NIBRS data sets will include information about the actual circumstance. So that could be related to the actual information that's been collected during an investigation that, say for example, if there was some kind of instance where an offender had engaged in an act that was related to a gang, or if a homicide had occurred under an argument of the heat of passion with, say, a spouse cheating on someone else, that those are types of things that are included in those circumstances. So in the UCR, they only include circumstantial or circumstance information for homicide. So that, as I had mentioned, that the UCR has some more detailed information for some crimes. So homicides have a supplemental homicide report. So instead of just reporting the number of homicides, the UCR does include some circumstances surrounding homicides. However, the NIBRS data set includes circumstance data on homicides, on aggravated assault. So those are just some things that NIBRS contains more information on. Additionally, the NIBRS data sets can report whether or not a suspect was under the influence of drugs, narcotics, anything like that, during a crime or shortly before the commission of a crime. So that can be useful for understanding the relationship between substance use and crimes. And then lastly, there are more crimes that are actually included in NIBRS. So again, with the UCR, there are 10 Part 1 offenses, and those are mandatory to complete on, but NIBRS includes more crimes. So, the crimes that NIBRS includes are broken down into Group A and Group B crimes. So you can kind of think of Group A as being similar to the Part 1 crimes in the UCR, and the Group B crimes as being similar to the Part 2 crimes in the UCR. So the Group A crimes in NIBRS includes 46 different types of crimes, compared to only the 10 in the Part 1 offenses of the UCR. So, NIBRS includes a lot more information on each crime, and it also includes more crimes. Additionally, something that's interesting about NIBRS is that they include crimes that are against persons, against property, and then also crimes against society. So these crimes could be including things like drug use, gambling, liquor law violations. There's not as much consistent information on those crimes in the UCR, but the NIBRS dataset does include a little bit more information about that. So, don't necessarily have to write all these down or memorize all of these, but they are just to show you the different categories that the NIBRS dataset includes in their Group A crimes. So there are 22 categories in the Group A crimes, and this entails 46 total offenses. So for under each of these, say for example for assault, they have simple assault and aggravated assault. So this is showing you the 22 categories, but there are actually 46 offenses. So these are the ones that include the most detail, and again, NIBRS includes many more crimes in their Group A crimes compared to the UCR with the Part 1 crimes. So the NIBRS Group B crimes, you can think of these as being similar to the UCR Part 2 crimes. And so although the UCR has more crimes that are listed under their Part 2 crimes, NIBRS does include more information in their Part 1 crimes. And so these include, under the Group B crimes, pretty much any other crime that's not included in the Group A crime. So some issues with NIBRS, some of the limitations is that NIBRS currently it's not representative. And so UCR captures approximately 98% of the population. So whereas the UCR covers about 98%, NIBRS only covers about 25% of the population. So one of the downfalls or limitations to this is that although it's really detailed, that it could make it much more difficult for police precincts to report their data. And so that could make it almost too tedious for police precincts to choose to participate. Given the complex nature and how much information is collected, this may also present difficulties for researchers who want to analyze the data, so that could be problematic as well. And lastly, so some of the exact same limitations of the UCR exist for NIBRS. And the reason that they still exist for NIBRS is because, again, NIBRS is police-reported crimes. So it is capturing police arrest practices and not necessarily the population's engagement in crime. So that's why it can underestimate crime and also present misleading data on arrestees. So moving to the third data set is the National Crime Victimization Survey. The NCVS is how we refer to that. It started in the 1970s, and what's really nice about this data set is the primary source of information on criminal victimization. So this particular survey is not coming from law enforcement. The NCVS is taking individuals' reports of their own victimization. So this is kind of a different perspective than UCR and NIBRS. So one of the reasons that this was created was because the UCR and NIBRS now are from police perspective. So it kind of relates and reflects police behavior versus this was created to address some of those shortcomings of police-reported data. So, again, one of the objectives was to develop information about victims and consequences of being a victim of crime. Additionally, the purpose of this data set was to estimate crimes that are not reported to police. So I think I mentioned it earlier, any type of crime that the police does not know about are considered the dark figure of crime. And so this survey is trying to tap people's victimization experiences that they did not necessarily report to police. And then this data set also provides a consistent measurement of selected types of crimes, because every person that's asked in the survey is getting the same exact definition of crime prior to them answering questions on it. And so finally, something else that the reason that this was created was to compare different time periods, so across time and then across areas or locations. And the way that this survey is different than the other data sets is because this is a nationally representative sample of households. So there's about 135,000 households that are sampled, and that household stays in the survey for 3 years. Within those 3 years, the house that's in the survey is sampled every 6 months. So for every 6 months for 3 years, there's about 135,000 houses that are surveying or that are responding to surveys on their victimization experiences. So one person in the household is then sampled and they report on their own, and then everyone else's who lives in the house, everyone else's victimization experiences. So if, for example, some limitations of that could be that an individual is reporting on someone else's victimization, so they might not know about the other household members' victimizations. And then additionally, that because this is a household survey, if a family moves within the 3-year period that they're in the survey, because it's a household survey, that house stays in the survey even though new people could be moving there. So this is a little bit different because it's not reported by police, and it's reported by individuals about themselves and their household victimization experiences. So the details that are included in the NCVS are, some of it is the same, but then some of it's a little bit different from the other data sets that we've talked about. So what's nice is that the survey respondents give information about themselves, so they know they can report on their age, their sex, race and ethnic origins, racial and ethnic origins, marital status, education, income, anything that you can think of. The respondents are reporting about themselves and their household members. So for each participant in the survey, they are asked if they had experienced victimization, and then they're asked about all of their household members and whether or not their household members experienced a victimization. For each victimization experience, so for each crime that they were a victim of, they are able to report on their perceptions of the offender. So the characteristics could include age, the offender's race and ethnicity, the offender's sex, and they can also report on the victim-offender relationship, so if they knew the offender or not. So those kind of things are included. Additionally, the circumstances for each victimization, they can report on the time of day that it occurred, where it occurred at, whether or not there was a weapon involved, if they had any injury, if there were any economic consequences. So there's a lot of circumstances that they're able to report on. And then finally, one of the most interesting things in the NCVS is that it asks people whether or not the reported victimization was reported to police. So if it wasn't reported to police, the respondents are able to answer why they didn't report it. So when I had said earlier that police only know about 3% of all crimes, part of that estimate is due to surveys like this. So the NCVS collects information on non-fatal personal crimes. So that includes different types of assaults, that includes robbery and larceny in various forms, and that also includes the household property crimes of burglary and motor vehicle theft and some other thefts. So, but what's also interesting is that instead of just listing these out and saying, did you experience an aggravated assault, the survey gives a respondent the definition and then also descriptions of each type of crime to try and ensure the accuracy of the responses. Notably also, similar to the other data sets, this doesn't really include information on white-collar crime, so that might divert attention away from the seriousness of white-collar crime. And then, so some criticisms or limitations of the NCVS is that it underestimates victimization. One of the things that I wanted to point out, if you didn't notice on the last slide, that homicide is not included in the NCVS. Because if you think about it, individuals are reporting on their own victimization experiences. So if someone has been a victim of homicide, they are not in the survey. So, doesn't include homicide. Additionally, the other ways in which it can underestimate crime is that individuals may not know what victimization experiences that their household members had experienced. So that could be an inaccurate or underestimation of crime. Similar to the other things, the other data sets, it can underestimate crime because it doesn't focus on white-collar crimes, and it doesn't ask about every single type of crime. And with regard to overestimation, individuals could overestimate their victimization experiences. Like if they mistake a non-criminal event as being a crime, then they might report it as though it had happened, but it really may not actually be classified as a crime. So that could be one way that crimes are overestimated by the NCVS. And then additionally, there's an issue with self-report surveys in general, is that usually surveys ask, have you experienced X, Y, and Z in the last 6 months or the last year or whatever the context is. And there's this issue called telescoping where individuals will think that, oh yes, I was a victim of larceny and that was 3 months ago. But in reality, if that victimization experience was 6 months ago and it's outside of the range of interest, then that can be an overestimation of victimization. So telescoping can sometimes be an issue. And then lastly, similar to the other data sets, a misleading data on suspect characteristics. And because these are victims reporting on their perceptions of the offender, and so that could be influenced by people's stereotypes and what they perceive unconsciously or subconsciously offenders to look like, so that could be an issue with NCVS as well. So the NCVS was a household survey, and there are other types of surveys that are just self-report, so it's an individual who is only reporting on their own experiences, not anyone else that they may know. And there are thousands of different types of self-report studies, so I won't be going over any details on specific self-report studies. I can mention a few, but overall, just to know, how does the self-report study differ from these other examples? So, the self-report studies are when, in the context of crime, that people may report about their own involvement in crime or the criminal justice system. So these are helpful because it can cover criminal behavior that's not necessarily been known to police. But in these reports, it may have some of the same limitations as the NCVS, because people could think that they had engaged in crime but they really didn't, or they may think that they didn't engage in a crime but they really did. And some of the problems with these self-report studies continue with no matter what the survey or what the self-report study is. But regardless, this does shed light on that dark figure of crime. These are conducted with interviews and surveys. So interviews are the qualitative collections of data, and so that could be an interview question that asks an open-ended question, versus surveys sometimes are more quantitatively based, and so it would just ask numerical information about engaging in crime. And I should mention that the self-report studies can ask about crime, they could ask about victimization, they could ask about involvement in the criminal justice system. It doesn't even have to be about crime at all. There are plenty of self-report studies on medical outcomes, just anything you can think of. So with self-report studies, there are thousands I had mentioned. And so sometimes self-report studies will include surveys of students. I'm not sure about New York, but I know in the state of Ohio that it was pretty common for high schoolers to take a survey each year about their alcohol and drug use patterns. So that would just be one example of students partaking in a survey. Could be of the general public. It could also be of people who are incarcerated. So self-report studies can contain a variety of different types of populations. Some issues with self-report studies is that more often than not, they focus on trivial or minor crimes. And so there's one data set that I use, and it's called the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health. The shorter name of that is AdHealth, and it's a nationally representative sample And one of the biggest critiques of that is that they're trivial offenses. So sometimes it could be like truancy, so not going to school, could be running away from home, could be alcohol use under the age of 21, could be taking someone's car out for a ride without their permission, so like joyriding. And so some of these issues are present in self-report studies because if you're sampling a general population, then it's fairly unlikely that you would have had respondents who are engaging in very serious crimes. So self-report studies don't always capture some of those more heinous crimes. There's also issues with self-report studies on respondent truthfulness. So one of the issues could be that respondents purposefully lie on self-report studies. It could also be that people are inadvertently not telling the truth and unknown to them, they may try to be honest, but it's not always true. And so there's sometimes some issues with that. And then finally, it can be pretty hard to obtain a nationally representative sample. So when you have researchers or principal investigators who are collecting information on a sample, that it would be really difficult, the actual method. So if you, in the future, take social research methods, that might help give you more context about what it even means to be nationally representative. But so it's pretty difficult and time-consuming and costly to obtain large samples that are nationally representative. So, all in all, the data that we've covered today, we talked about the UCR, we talked about NIBRS, and we talked about the NCVS, and we've talked about self-report studies. So, again, I didn't go on very many specifics of self-report studies, but just so that you know a little bit of a difference between that and other official records of crime. So, all of these data sets on crime and victimization are limited. Not one data set is perfect for measuring anything that individuals want, and more often than not, depending on what you want to study would influence which data set that you would choose. So, thinking about these 5 different types of crimes or situations that are listed here: homicide, rape, white-collar crime, less serious crimes, and then formal responses to crimes or arrests. Which data set, or which of the types of data that I just talked about, would you choose to study those? So think about that, and I'll go through them here just in a second. So thinking about homicide, if you wanted to study homicide, which data set or which type of data would you use? Sometimes students say that they might choose UCR or NIBRS. Either one would tap homicide. One of the issues with NIBRS is that the population that's covered is a little bit smaller. So it's only 25% of the population, so that could be an issue. But still, the UCR has limitations. NCVS is not applicable to homicide because they do not ask about homicide. And then self-report studies generally don't have information on those types of serious crimes. So if you wanted to measure the occurrence of rape, what data set would you use, or which type of data would you use? Sometimes students would answer that they would use the UCR, NIBRS, NCVS, and so those 3 types of data, or those 3 data sets, would all be applicable to studying the incident of rape. And with the UCR, I don't recall if I had mentioned it earlier, but one of the issues with the UCR is that the definition for rape up until 2013 only included female victims. So one of the issues with the UCR is that the definition of rape has changed over time, and so from 2013 on, it looks like there was an increase in the number of rapes that had occurred, but in fact it's because the definition itself had actually changed to include male victims. So the UCR might be a little limited in using that to assess rape. And NIBRS, again, small population, but they would have a lot of information per incident. And then the NCVS could be applicable, although it's quite possible that if an individual is in a survey, they may not want to disclose that information, or if they're reporting on their household members, they may not know that information. So with white-collar crime, you may have guessed this is kind of a tricky question because it really isn't covered very accurately with any of the types of data that we've talked about today. So there are some questions or some types of white-collar crime that are included in the official statistics, which include the UCR and NIBRS, but by and large it really isn't covered much. For less serious crimes, this is likely fairly obvious since we just talked about it with regard to self-report studies. So self-report studies usually focus on less serious crimes. If you recall from the UCR and the NIBRS discussion that those less serious crimes are often included as a part of those Part 2 offenses in the UCR or Group B offenses in NIBRS, and so they don't contain as much information, and it's not always mandatory for precincts to report on those less serious crimes. And then finally, formal responses to crime indicates police reports of crime, so arrest statistics. And so the formal responses to crime, that's captured within the UCR and NIBRS. So in all of these different cases, you can see that depending on what you would want to study or analyze, that it might influence what type of data that you utilize. So just briefly here at the end, I wanted to go over some of the trends in crime, and I'm aware that this figure is fairly blurry, but just to give you an idea, that the left side, the axis is in 1990, and it goes up until 2015 is the last full set of data on that. And so this is coming from the Uniform Crime Reports, and this figure in particular is the overarching crime rate, and this clearly illustrates that from the 1990s until the late 2000s and mid 2010s actually, that the crime rate has decreased substantially. So just to know that the crime rates have decreased since the 1990s. This second graph, it's a little bit better, it's not as blurry, is the violent crime rate, and this again is based on the Uniform Crime Reports, the UCR, and so from 1990 to 2015, crime rates have decreased substantially. You see a little bit of an uptick in the last couple of years here, but again, that overall the trend is down. And this last figure, just to illustrate some of the problems in focusing on a narrow range of years. So if you look at between 2012 to 2016, for example, this would suggest that the crime rate, and this is violent crime rate, has increased. You know, it's done an uptick. But remember, if you go back and look at it in the larger trend, you can see that it's actually decreased since the 1990s. So I just wanted to point that out as an important thing to show that when you're looking at trends in crime, that they can be easily misunderstood if the range of time is too narrow. So that concludes the information on the ways in which we measure crime in the United States. And so if you have any questions while you're studying this, please let me know.